At the beginning, what often goes unnoticed is how convincing the feeling of relief can be for an avoidant. When the relationship ends, they don't immediately collapse under the weight of loss the way others might. Instead, there's a sense of regained control. The emotional intensity is gone. The expectations, the vulnerability, the perceived pressure, all of it disappears overnight. And for someone who has spent their life equating closeness with overwhelm, that absence can feel like safety. But this relief is not what it appears to be. It isn't resolution. It isn't clarity. It's distance, emotional distance from something they never fully allowed themselves to experience in the first place. In psychological terms, avoidant individuals are highly skilled at deactivating their attachment system. They suppress emotional needs, minimize the importance of connection, and reframe intimacy as something optional rather than essential. So when the relationship ends, they don't feel the loss immediately because they've trained themselves not to feel it. What they experience instead is the removal of discomfort, and they misinterpret that as peace. But real peace has substance. It has warmth. It has presence. What they are feeling is the absence of friction, not the presence of fulfillment. And this is where the shift begins, because over time, silence doesn't remain neutral. It starts to speak. The absence of your voice, your consistency, your emotional availability, it begins to take shape. What once felt like spaciousness slowly becomes emptiness. And emptiness has a way of revealing truths that distraction can only delay, not eliminate. They begin to notice the small things first, the lack of meaningful conversation, the absence of someone who understood them without needing everything explained. The quiet becomes heavier, not lighter. And in that quiet, there are no distractions left to hide behind, no relationship to blame, no expectations to resist, just themselves, and the space where something real used to exist. Philosophically, this is the moment where avoidance collapses under its own illusion. Because avoidance only works in the presence of something to avoid. Once that something is gone, the strategy loses its function. There is nothing left to push away. And without that dynamic, they are left face to face with a deeper discomfort they've been trying to escape all along. Emotional disconnection from themselves. This is why the absence hits differently over time. It's no longer about missing a person in a conventional sense. It's about confronting what that person represented: connection, depth, emotional safety, and realizing that those things are now gone, not because they were taken, but because they were not fully received. And that realization doesn't come all at once. It unfolds slowly, almost quietly. A memory surfaces unexpectedly. A moment replays, but this time with more clarity. What they once dismissed as too much starts to look like care. What they labeled as pressure begins to resemble effort. And the narrative they told themselves at the time, the one that justified their distance, starts to weaken. Because distance distorts reality, but absence clarifies it. And here's where the weight of it truly settles in. They begin to understand that what they felt as relief was actually the removal of something meaningful. Not something burdensome, not something excessive, something rare. And that recognition carries a different kind of gravity. It's not dramatic, it's not explosive, it's quiet, but it lingers. This is the point where loneliness is no longer just being alone. It becomes the awareness that you had something genuine, and let it go, not out of necessity, but out of fear. And fear, when seen clearly, has consequences that are hard to reconcile with, because now the absence isn't just external, it becomes internal. A gap forms between who they are and who they could have been within that connection. And that gap is not easily filled by new people, new distractions, or new experiences. It stays because it's tied to a realization rather than a circumstance. So what began as relief transforms into something far more complex. Not immediate regret that comes later, but the early architecture of it. The recognition that peace without connection is incomplete. That silence, when stretched over time, stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like loss. And the most unsettling part is this. They come to understand that the very thing they were trying to protect themselves from the depth of connection is the same thing they now find themselves missing. And by the time that understanding takes hold, the silence is no longer a choice. It's a consequence. And if the first phase is defined by absence, the second is defined by something far more disorienting: arrival. Not your return, but the return of everything they postponed feeling. Because avoidant individuals don't lack emotion. They lack immediate access to it. Their entire psychological structure is built around deferral, pushing feelings aside in real time, convincing themselves that what they feel isn't urgent, isn't necessary, or simply isn't there. During the relationship, this creates a kind of imbalance where one person is processing everything as it happens, while the other is quietly storing it away, unresolved. But emotion, by its nature, doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And eventually, it demands to be acknowledged. This is where the delayed emotional awakening begins. It doesn't announce itself dramatically. There's no single moment where everything becomes clear. Instead, it seeps in gradually, often when they least expect it. A random memory surfaces not just as an image, but with feeling attached this time. A conversation they once brushed off begins to replay with a different tone. The emotional significance they once minimized starts to feel heavier, more defined. What's happening here is minoti emotion, its old emotion, finally being processed. And this shift can be deeply unsettling for them because it disrupts the narrative they've been relying on. Up until this point, they've told themselves a story that justified their distance. Maybe the connection was too intense. Maybe it wasn't right. Maybe they just needed space. These explanations create a sense of control, a sense that their choices were rational and necessary. But delayed awareness begins to erode that certainty. Because now, with time and distance, they are no longer reacting, they are reflecting. And reflection introduces context. It introduces nuance. It allows them to see not just what they felt in the moment, but what they didn't allow themselves to feel. And that's where the tension begins. They start to recognize that what they labeled as overwhelming may have actually been intimacy. What they dismissed as pressure may have been emotional investment. And what they interpreted as a need to escape may have been a response to vulnerability they didn't know how to handle. This is not a comfortable realization. In fact, it creates a kind of internal contradiction. Because on one hand, they still carry the instinct to avoid, to distance, to protect themselves. But on the other hand, they are now faced with evidence that something meaningful was present-hand, that they didn't fully engage with it. This is where regret begins to take shape, but it's not yet fully formed. At this stage, it's more like confusion mixed with recognition. A quiet awareness that something important was mishandled, but without a clear way to resolve it. And what makes this phase particularly difficult is timing. Because while they are just beginning to feel the emotional weight of the connection, the other person you have already moved through the most intense stages of pain. You've already sat with the loss. You've already questioned, processed, and begun to rebuild. So there's an asymmetry here that cannot be ignored. Their awakening comes at a point when your detachment has already begun. Philosophically, this introduces a kind of temporal dissonance. Two people sharing the same relationship but experiencing its emotional reality at completely different times. And by the time those timelines begin to overlap, they are no longer aligned in the same way. For the avoidant, this can create a sense of urgency that feels unfamiliar. They may start to think about reaching out, about revisiting what was left unresolved. But even then, the old patterns don't disappear. The same fear of vulnerability, the same hesitation, the same internal resistance that's all still there, now competing with a growing awareness of loss. So instead of clear action, there is often hesitation, overthinking, internal dialogue that goes in circles. They feel something now, but they don't fully trust it. They question whether it's real, whether it's temporary, whether acting on it would expose them in ways they're not prepared for. And so the awakening continues, but without resolution. What's important to understand here is that this phase is not about sudden transformation. It's about confrontation, being confronted with emotions they delayed, meanings they overlooked, and a version of the relationship they didn't fully see until it was no longer available to them. And that confrontation has weight, because once you see something clearly, you can't return to not seeing it. Once you feel something fully, you can't convince yourself it was never there. The emotional distance that once protected them now becomes the very thing that intensifies the realization. They are no longer shielded from the impact of their choices. And this is where the foundation of deeper regret is built, not in the moment of loss, but in the moment of understanding. Because it's one thing to lose something and believe it was necessary. It's another thing entirely to realize too late that it wasn't. And once that understanding begins to settle, once the emotional reality is no longer abstract but felt, the next shift is almost inevitable. It's no longer just about what they lost in a general sense. It becomes specific, defined, personal. Because now, they don't just feel the absence of connection, they start to measure it. This is where comparison enters, not as a conscious strategy at first, but as a natural byproduct of experience. They move forward, they meet new people, they engage in new interactions, and on the surface, everything appears functional. Conversations happen, time is spent. There may even be moments that resemble what they once had, but something is different, and more importantly, something is missing. And it's in these ordinary, seemingly unremarkable moments that the realization begins to sharpen. What they encounter often lacks depth, not necessarily because the new people are incapable of it, but because depth requires a level of openness and emotional participation they themselves have historically struggled to sustain. So what they find instead are connections that remain on the surface pleasant, manageable, but ultimately limited. And that's when the contrast becomes unavoidable. Because what they had with you wasn't just interaction, it was resonance. There was a level of understanding that didn't require constant explanation, a kind of emotional fluency that made things feel effortless, even when they were complex. You weren't simply present, you were engaged in a way that asked for nothing artificial, nothing performative, and at the time, that may have felt like too much. But now, in the absence of it, it begins to look like something else entirely, something rare. This is the point where the narrative they once held starts to collapse more definitively. The idea that there will be something easier, something better suited begins to lose credibility, because ease, as they start to realize, is not the same as fulfillment. Simplicity is not the same as connection, and what once felt manageable now feels insufficient. There's a philosophical weight to this realization because it forces a reevaluation of value, not in abstract terms, but in lived experience. They begin to understand that what they had was not just another relationship, it was a convergence of qualities that don't easily replicate. Your patience, for example, may have once been interpreted as something they could take for granted. Your willingness to understand them, to give space without withdrawing entirely, to remain consistent even when things felt uncertain, these were not neutral traits. They were investments, and investments, when unrecognized, often become losses. So now, they begin to look back, but this time with a different lens. Moments that once felt ordinary begin to stand out. The way you handled conflict, the way you communicated without escalation, the way you stayed present even when it would have been easier to detach. These details, which were once overshadowed by their own internal discomfort, now take on new meaning. And meaning, once assigned, is difficult to dismiss. This is where the idea of irreplaceability begins to take hold, not in an exaggerated or romanticized way, but in a grounded, almost logical sense. It's not that no one else could ever connect with them. It's that what you offered was specific, contextual, built over time through consistency and emotional availability. And that kind of connection isn't something that can be quickly recreated, because it wasn't quickly formed. There's also a subtle but important shift in responsibility here. Earlier, the focus may have been external, what the relationship lacked, what felt overwhelming, what didn't work. But now, the focus turns inward. They begin to see how their own patterns influenced the outcome, how their distance created gaps that you were trying to bridge, how their reluctance to engage fully limited what the relationship could become. And this recognition doesn't come with immediate resolution. It comes with weight. Because understanding your value now doesn't change the fact that it wasn't fully acknowledged then. And that gap between awareness and action, that's where regret deepens. Not just because they lost something meaningful, but because they begin to see that the loss was not inevitable. It was, at least in part, the result of choices they made or didn't make. And that's a difficult position to reconcile with. Because it removes the comfort of ambiguity. It replaces "it just didn't work" with something more precise. It could have worked differently, under different levels of awareness, presence, and willingness. And once that possibility becomes clear, it doesn't disappear. It lingers in the background of new interactions, in moments of quiet reflection, in the subtle comparisons they didn't intend to make but can no longer avoid. You become, in a sense, a reference point, not in a way that idealizes you beyond reality, but in a way that highlights what was once real and is now absent. And that's where the realization settles fully. You are not interchangeable. You are not simply a phase or an experience or a temporary connection. You are a combination of qualities, timing, and emotional depth that aligned in a way that is not easily repeated. And by the time they understand that, the context has already changed, because value, when recognized too late, doesn't return as opportunity. It returns as clarity. And clarity, without the ability to act on it, becomes something else entirely. It becomes regret rooted not in what was lost, but in what was finally understood when it was no longer yours to keep. And once recognition settles in once, they can no longer deny the value of what they had. Or the depth of what they lost, something more complex begins to unfold underneath it all, because awareness on its own does not resolve the internal structure that created the distance in the first place. This is where the real conflict begins. On one side, there is clarity, a growing, quiet understanding that the connection was meaningful, that it mattered more than they allowed themselves to believe at the time. On the other side, there is the same internal architecture that shaped their avoidance in the first place, an instinct toward emotional self-protection, a discomfort with vulnerability, a learned reflex to retreat when things feel too exposing. And these two forces do not coexist peacefully, they compete. This is why regret in avoidant individuals rarely presents itself in a simple, straightforward way. It is not a clean emotional state, it is fractured. One part of them reaches toward understanding, toward acknowledgement, toward the possibility of confronting what was lost. Another part resists that movement entirely because acknowledgement requires exposure and exposure feels unsafe. So instead of resolution, what emerges is tension, a silent, ongoing negotiation. Within the self, they may think about reaching out. They may draft messages and delete them. They may revisit memories with increasing frequency, noticing details they once overlooked. But each time emotion moves toward action, something interrupts it, not always consciously but structurally, a pause, a hesitation, a return to silence. And in that pause, ego begins to play its role. Ego here is not simply arrogance, it is defense. It is the part of the mind that tries to preserve coherence, to maintain the identity they have built around being fine without needing too much, better off alone, more self-sufficient than emotionally dependent. That identity was not created randomly, it was constructed to manage discomfort. So when regret enters, ego does what it was designed to do. It reframes. It says things like, "It wasn't that serious, it wouldn't have worked anyway. They would have overwhelmed me eventually. I did what was right for me at the time." These thoughts are not always fully believed, but they are stabilizing. They reduce emotional intensity. They create distance from vulnerability. And for someone who has historically equated vulnerability with loss of control, that distance feels necessary. But beneath ego, truth continues to persist. And truth is quieter, but more persistent. It shows up in moments where distraction fades, late at night, during routine activities, in unexpected emotional triggers. It shows up when nothing is actively demanding their attention, and suddenly there is space for reflection that cannot be easily redirected. In those moments, ego weakens, and what surfaces is not just memory but responsibility, not in a punitive sense but in a clarifying one. They begin to see their role more clearly, not as villainy, not as failure, but as limitation, a limitation in emotional availability, a limitation in tolerance for depth at the time it was required, a limitation in understanding what was being offered until it was longer accessible. And that realization is uncomfortable because it removes the protective distance they maintained between what happened and what they did. Now those two begin to merge, and when they merge, regret becomes heavier because it is no longer abstract. It is no longer about a lost relationship in general terms. It becomes personal accountability for a missed moment of connection that cannot be recreated in the same form. Still, even with this understanding, action does not easily follow. This is the paradox of the avoidant internal world. Awareness does not automatically translate into emotional risk-taking. Knowing something is meaningful does not guarantee the ability to act in alignment with that knowledge. So they remain in this suspended space, feeling but not fully expressing, understanding but not fully engaging, regretting but not fully resolving. And this is where the emotional weight intensifies, not because of what they feel, but because of what they cannot do with what they feel. Because regret without resolution does not fade quickly. It lingers. It repeats.